Um, Welcome to G-Spodcast, Roger Crowley. Thank you very much for being a guest here. Um, like I said in the initial conversation, I'm a very big fan of your work. The only book that I haven't read was your last one, actually.
Yeah.
But you wrote books about. Can you hear me? Yeah, you wrote books about the fall of Constantinople, 1453. You wrote books about the battle for dominance in the Mediterranean in the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire, the let's say Serenissima, the Venice and her thalassocratic empire, if I have to say that. Um, is there also the Crusades? There is something very fascinating in that clash of cultures, clash of civilizations. Um, with the Islamic world, with the meeting of new cultures in the Pacific Ocean, with the Portuguese and so on. Why would you choose that theme in your work?
I think basically I started out with a fascination with the Mediterranean world. And my dad was actually a naval officer, so I spent quite a bit of my childhood in the Mediterranean. I also spent a fair bit of time when I was in my early 20s in Turkey. And I was very aware of the confrontation, if you like, at that particular point between the Byzantine world and the Ottoman world. And it kind of expanded out from there, obviously, to a kind of wider terrain. I think the interesting thing that really got me going was that the intensity of the contest in the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is a small sea with clustering peoples around the edge of all sorts of faiths and imperial missions, if you like. And that was what interested me. The other thing is that I particularly liked this period. I'm putting aside the Crusades, but looking at Constantinople, Venice, and all that stuff, is that in the 16th century you tend to get a great deal more first-hand accounts written down because of the development of printing. In fact, you get an explosion of information in that time. And this provided an opportunity really to hear the voices of the people of the period talking about what they did, why they did it. So the Mediterranean was really the starting point for me, obviously Venice as well. I've obviously moved out beyond the Mediterranean to look at the wider world with the spice. But that's really where it came. It came from my background, it came from my interest in maritime history, and it came from my interest particularly in the Byzantine and the Ottoman worlds.
And also in the 16th century, it is very interesting because you have those great powers like the Ottoman Empire, you have the Habsburgs Empire of Carlos I or Carl V and his son Philip II. But you also have the power of France, Francois I, who did some kind of alliance with the Suleiman the Magnificent at that time. What was the world in the 16th century if we have to move a 21st century person to that time? What will he will find surprising, let's say?
What would be surprising? That's a tricky one. To me, everything was surprising about the 16th century, but I think it is this sense of within the Mediterranean world, these two guys, Carlos V and Suleiman the Magnificent, both intent on a kind of a messianic sense of destiny, really, that they were going to be effectively rulers of the world. They were both completely obsessed with the idea of being Caesar, and the epicenter of this obviously would have been Rome, and Suleiman the Magnificent had ambitions to capture Rome and kill the Pope and so on. So it's a kind of one of those centuries where I think because of as you move out of the Middle Ages, warfare and imperial destiny grows because you have more resources, you have the new technologies, in both in sailing ships and gunpowder weapons and so on, to dream big in a scale that, and also the financial resources as well, to dream big, really. And it was this idea of dreaming big by both these guys that it kind of accelerated them into this idea of a huge, obviously religiously backed destiny to be effectively the ruler of the world. And we may well have people like that at the moment, but in the 16th century, it's a new era, really. I think things start to accelerate out of the Middle Ages, with all kinds of new military technologies, financial instruments, and so on. And I see the 16th century, I call it the age of acceleration, when things move faster. There's more information, there's more ability to tax people and to gather wealth together, and there's more information.
And also, I believe there is in the 14th century, in the 13th century, you don't have that kind of a power like those kind of superpowers that you have already in the 16th century. Like the Ottoman Empire is not so big. They captured Constantinople in the middle of the 15th century. So, and obviously Habsburg Spain is not. I mean, like they're two different countries. So they united in 1492 with in Castile and Aragon. Um, all right. But let me ask you this: what was going from the siege of Constantinople, writing the last book about spices, obviously, and the trade, the world trade with spices? What was your favorite book to research?
I think I would have to say Empires of the Sea. It's a close field, actually, because of the wealth of resource material and my fascination of it's a good opportunity. I had a good opportunity to visit all these places, to go to Cyprus, to go to Istanbul, to go to Spain, to go to Rhodes. But I was, I suppose I knew this field quite well, but I was
The siege of
similarly
Acre,
fascinated, I think, by my last book,
1291,
Spice,
the
which is
last
really
Crusader
a
stronghold.
bust out of the Mediterranean
Is
world into a much wider arena, and that book introduced me to a whole new set of ideas, views of the world, and so on. But I think Empires of the Sea was the book that was kind of richest in source material of all the books that I wrote. The sources for Fall of Constantinople are quite slender, actually, and you have to work quite hard. There are only about a dozen short accounts on the Byzantine side of the Fall of Constantinople, and unfortunately, on the whole, the Ottoman sources are silent, certainly for that event. It's basically an oral culture at that time. There's a bit more writing in the 16th century, but still, there's not as much. It's less rewarding, really, than the Christian sources. So, I think it is that book, really, that there are so many episodes, so many confrontations, so many forces at work in the Mediterranean at that period. And because of the fact that you can visit all these places, you can stand where the Knights of St John made their last stand in Rhodes. You can go to Cyprus and see where Bragg got skinned alive in northern in Famagusta. You can touch the ground, really, and that was a very additional reward, I think, in the writing of the book.
And I'm sure that you growing up in Malta, seeing those. I don't know if you lived in La Valletta, but looking at those fortress that the knights hospitaliers had to defend in 1565 was a real inspiration to write later about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it sort of introduced me to history as a child, just walking on the bastions of Valletta. Also, I was very interested in the prehistory of Malta as well. But yeah, it was kind of in the blood. My dad has a ship sunk somewhere off Crete during the Second World War. Unfortunately, he survived that one. So it's kind of like part of my DNA, actually, that world.
You also made the point that language is very important in your historical research. Um, how important actually is knowing a new language, studying to like, do you study the language just to be able to read the ancient sources, or reading and writing and talking is part of it?
Yeah. I'm not a great linguist, I can say, but it is essential, really. I taught myself to read reasonable Italian. I can speak Turkish reasonably. It's one of those languages actually where it's easier to speak the language than it is to read it, and I slog through various passages of Turkish. As I said, the sources weren't great, and if I'd waited a year or two, I could have had Google Translate. But language is important. It's certainly very important, and one of the side things that are useful really is that I'm incredibly grateful for generations of PhD students who have translated or written material that has been relevant to what I've done. I would say I was very poorly equipped to set about moving into this world, but actually that's all part of the adventure really in having to tackle the languages. Having to, I can read reasonable Portuguese now. I still can't understand a word the Portuguese say because they seem to swallow all the ends of their words. I'm sure they'll complain bitterly about that, but I love Portuguese as a language to hear. But I find it easier to read these languages. I can read Latin quite well than I can speak them. It's an important part of the, if you want to step out of your own culture. To try and tangle with this stuff, and so that's always educational, always interesting to me. It obviously takes up quite large areas of time, and I think I'm producing a book every 3 or 4 years, really, and there doesn't seem to be any way of doing it more quickly. And certainly, I'm probably slowing down as I get older. But these are all an adventure. They're an adventure in reading. They're an adventure in discovering other people's histories, and I've been enormously gratified and humbled by some of the responses that I get from people from other cultures and languages. People in Portuguese who I think must know their history inside out, but are still enormously pleased. I think that somebody is Portuguese history is underwritten about, I think, by outsiders. And the reward that I get, actually, I get quite a lot of emails from people saying, I really enjoyed this book. It meant something to me. I've read it 4 times, which is probably more than I've read my own book now. And that's such a reward. It's like you're sitting in this room, or if you're lucky, you're allowed to go to Rhodes or, Lisbon or somewhere for a while. You're sitting in this room writing this stuff, like in your own echo chamber, and the reward is Georgie, is like people like yourself who say that they really enjoyed the books. That really means something to me, actually, and it is an incentive to write because, unlike any other art form, like being a musician or a painter or somebody where people will actually look firsthand at your work, particularly being a musician. Writers sit in their rooms for a long time and go quietly nuts, really, as far as I can see. So this business of writing it's heartwarming to know that books have meant something to somebody else.
Well, you said musician, but literature, I would say your books are they're historical books with facts nevertheless, but there is like a sense of literature in it. Like there is a sense of they're made of flesh and blood, of living characters, and the eyewitness accounts that you used, and the people that your characters, they sound more true and more alive than a regular historical book for me. How important is the eyewitness
Yeah,
accounts and the literature, especially in your writing, as an
I,
inspiration?
I, I I find eyewitness accounts really important, actually. You know, I was there, I did that. Um, they, they may not be true, uh, but that was what that person said at that particular time. Um, and from another point of view, actually, I think of myself as a writer as much as a historian. I mean, I actually have a degree in English literature. I don't have a degree in history. Um, so, you know, I'm a bit of a fraud, really. I'm writing well-researched books for general readers, really, and and the act of writing is very important to me. How I write.
Yeah, the ancient sources and the eyewitness accounts that you use.
Uh, yes, I'm particularly interested in hearing what people had to say at the time. As I say, it is a record of what somebody was feeling. It may not be true, and sometimes you're trying to cross-reference whether it's true or not. But I think to hear the voices of the past, really, to hear human beings talking in ways that we can actually connect with how they felt, what they did, what their experiences were, kind of shrinks the time distance between us in the 21st century and these people in the 16th century or the 15th century. And I think that sense of eyewitness account and personal story is really important to me. There's nothing more exciting. And I think this was certainly true in the case of the Siege of Malta, when I found Bossier's account of the Siege of Malta. He wasn't there, but he'd obviously interviewed a lot of people a bit later on. And this was all in 16th century Italian. I managed to get a copy of it and translate it. And that's so exciting when you hear, you know, some little incident that somebody said, so-and-so was standing on the battlements and he was hit on the helmet. He fell down, but he got up again. He was okay. That kind of familiar contact with the past is so rewarding, actually. And the 16th century is great for this because you're starting to get printing. You know, there are probably more books printed, volumes of books printed in the 16th century. Something between 150 and 200 million volumes were produced in the 16th century, which probably dominates, is larger than all the writing ever done in the history of the world up to that point. So you get this. That's what's so rewarding about, you know, the Caxton or whatever revolution, you know, Gutenberg or whatever, that it brings us these voices in ways which are, you know, when I wrote about the Siege of Acre, there were very, very few sources. There were a few Arabic sources, but you know, you're really having to work hard at that point to piece together a personal narrative, and it sort of tells in terms of, you know, we just don't know enough about the fall of Acre as much as we would like to. We do know what the Arabs said, but they were mainly interested in the politics rather than the actual fighting. So when you get to the 16th century, you get this stuff, you hear these people's voices. It's so exciting to discover and to write about.
And every time I read old literature, like even from the Roman Empire, when you read the Consolation to Marcia of Seneca, that still is still that writing and that the things that move his heart and move his quill moved our hearts too in a way. It's very weird feeling to uh, find something mutual and very heartwarming to find something that you have in common with a person even living in ancient Rome or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like this is a literature of 3,000 years, and I guess it's more easy even 500 years ago. People don't change so much, I suppose, with years. The technology changes, but what drives us as a human beings, it's still there. It's still the same, and it's similar at least. with people living in ancient Egypt or people living in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century or some other time, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's the little details, that they slip in a little fact about domestic life or something, some everyday thing. Often, those little things, I can't bring one to the top of my mind at the moment. You're absolutely right. They connect us to these people and make us realize that we're all humans, and we've always had the same kind of needs, desires, sorrows, across millennia, really. My knowledge of ancient history is not great, I have to say, but I'm sure you're right, that this is what makes us human. It makes us human beings.
Most of your books are revolving around sea power, about empires based on seas, like Portugal or Venice. What makes it so fascinating and interesting to write about um, mm, empire based on seas, and not the land empire like the Ottoman Empire? Although they had a very strong fleet, but you can't say they were
Yeah,
a sea empire.
yeah, yeah. Um, I'm not sure I can answer that one. It's my background. That the life on ships is something that I was experienced as a child. I used to go on my dad's ships and go on, the dangers of the sea, the sense of, I suppose, of discovery, that you can just, the ships travel faster than, camels and horses a bit. And I suppose the kind of intrinsic dangers of maritime travel. They are vectors of conquest, of trade, of diseases, of ideas, and the and the world that they create, I suppose, in terms of maritime ports, great trading centers. You can take Venice, you can take Acre, you can take Lisbon, you can take Seville, you can take Acapulco, Manila. These are all places where the nodal points of meetings, really, which are conducted by ship. And it's a different kind of invasion,
And the
really,
sea
I
was
suppose.
and the sea was also kind of a last frontier, at a final frontier in that century, I believe, because we didn't know what's on the other side. We didn't know the people and the different cultures in the Philippines or the Moloch Island or like in Borneo or a place like that. So, especially for Europeans, from the European point of view, it was plunging into the unknown in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk about the age of discoveries, really, but we could talk about the end of the isolation of Europe, really. The Romans knew more about the Indian Ocean than anybody in Europe did before European breakout. And it's very Eurocentric to talk about the age of discoveries, but the certainly, the 16th century was, when it wasn't going on in the Mediterranean, it was certainly going on elsewhere, and the barriers. I think the greatest of all the frontiers really was the conquest, if you can call it that, of the Pacific, really, because this was the sea of all seas, and the one that Europeans had absolutely no idea of. They had no idea how vast it was. The creating of these long-range linkages that happen as a result of Europeans pushing further and further. But of course, people in the Indian Ocean, the traders of the Indian Ocean and beyond had a perfectly good idea of a great deal of the planet, of which Europe was completely ignorant until we get Vasco da Gama and Columbus and all these guys breaking into new worlds, and we do see it from the European point of view. Really, I think this phrase, ghastly phrase, the age of discoveries. I think, as I say, it's probably like the end of European ignorance. Quite honestly.
Well, do you think there is this something like lost knowledge? And I'm asking you this question why? Because now we know that the Vikings actually end up in America long before Christopher Columbus. We know that the Phoenicians circumnavigated the continent of Africa. They were great explorers. What do you think? Is there anything else do you think we don't know? Like probably there is a lot of things out there that we still like. We kind of underestimate the the, the Asian civilizations and those cultures and their reach, their geographical reach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the great Chinese Admiral Zheng He, I think he's pronounced, who sailed calmly around the Indian Ocean in ships of huge size, 30,000 people, just really their technological knowledge, their knowledge of these places was extraordinary, and it's taken us a long time, I think, to catch up, realize, and to be honest, if we look at where the axis of the world is now, it's definitely shifting away from Europe. I think we have to look at the Far East, we have to look at China, we have to look at Japan, we have to, that India's going to turn itself into a powerhouse, and maybe we're in the process of seeing, the world spinning round again to back to that part of the world which was the center of the world in the past and will be again. Yeah.
A quick question here, just to follow up on what you're saying. Do you think the sea power is going to be still relevant in that dynamic between China and the West?
I think it's going to be. The Chinese are building aircraft carriers or whatever at the speed of knots at the moment. They're outproducing America by a huge amount. I suppose there's the issue which is obviously surfacing at the moment is how vulnerable is any warship to a sort of drone attack, long distance missile attack. The Chinese obviously believe that that they are going to dominate the sea again, and it's hard not to believe that that's going to happen. Quite what that means in terms of conquest, I wouldn't really like to say. I mean, the ground is shifting under our feet so fast on a daily basis as we look at, the war around Ukraine and what it's throwing up in terms of technologies and devices and so on. I mean, sea power, I don't know. I think everything's up for grabs at the moment. Whatever we in the West produce could be obsolete in a very short period of time. Certainly, there is a race at the moment going on, certainly from China's point of view, into dominating the oceans through sea power, and presumably all the technologies that go with it.
Well, I completely agree with that. I think they're even building artificial islands very close to their coast. So we'll see what's going to happen, obviously. But something that we talked about earlier, it's about the level of influence of literature in your writing. So I wanted to ask you, what are your literary inspirations when you write in a historical book? And I'm talking about literary fiction here. Great writers of literary fiction.
Literary fiction.
Or maybe you don't see it that way.
Yeah. I have to think about that one for a very long time. I mean, what do I go back to?
For example, for me, one of the best written accounts is The Conquest of Mexico from Bernal Diaz de Castillo. He's obviously this eyewitness account, and he was one of the Cortes entourage. But
yeah,
he writes like a real writer.
Right. I can't get my handle on this one, Georgia, in a short period of time. I mean, I read all sorts of stuff. I read, fiction. I read non-fiction. I don't think I could put my finger on any one writer who has influenced me or been the absolute model in what I write. So, I read a lot of travel writing. Actually, I'm interested in good travel writers, but I pass on that one.
Well, on to the next one then. Tell me more about your latest book. It came out last year, I think, 2024. About the spice trade.
Yeah.
And what was your initial interest in writing that book? Is it obviously a natural progression led to it, I guess? It's again in the 16th century.
Yeah. Well, it is a natural progression to my book Conquerors about the Portuguese. In 1511, the Portuguese get to Malacca on the tip of the Malay Peninsula and conquer it. And at that point, I was very curious as to what was going to be the next step. And the next step for the Portuguese was to find a way to the Spice Islands. And because when they get to Malacca, they meet a lot of merchants from the Malay archipelago, from the Philippines, Sumatra, Java, and even China. In fact, the first account of, strangely, Marco Polo never mentioned chopsticks, and a little bit suspicious about that one. But the first account of chopsticks in the European language was written by a Portuguese guy in Malacca when these Chinese merchants turn up. And I wanted to follow the Portuguese into the heart of the Spice Islands. Really, that was the impetus, really, to really. I was being drawn further and further east, like explorers, a literary explorer, or as they were, and so that's what led me really into the Spice Islands, and then to the Pacific Ocean, then to Magellan's voyage across the Pacific, then to the first contacts of the Portuguese with Japan, first contacts of the Portuguese with China, which are very unfortunate for the Portuguese because they didn't understand that the protocol when you turn up in China, there is no such thing as asking if you can talk to the emperor man to man. So it really was a curiosity that led me on. Portuguese curiosity, really. I think Portuguese are very interested people. Really, they say of the Portuguese, a small nation with the whole world to die in, and you can find little pockets of Portuguese everywhere in the world. They went to the Portuguese mentality is a very interesting one, really. I guess it comes from the fact that Portugal was a very poor country. They were on the prow of Europe. They were the natural people to step off the edge of the continent. But they really, they did all sorts of things. They're up the Yangtze River. They're trekking, upstream up the Amazon against the current. They're in Himalayas, Portuguese
Japan?
monks trying to convert the church. Yeah, they're in Japan. They were the first people in Japan. They introduced firearms into Japan, and so I'm interested in the Portuguese thing, the mentality of these people. Again, you kind of think, why did they do it? And indeed, I think there's a saying in English that from a quite famous novel called "The Past is Another Country," and trying to sometimes to bridge that imagination gap between now and why on earth did they do that? Magellan, 285 people set out, sail around the world, something like 18 come back, and 5 of them volunteer to go and do it again. And you think, what is wrong with these people? And it is the mentality of other people. I mean, probably they had nothing back to come back to or whatever. But the Portuguese were intrinsically curious, I think, and they were proto explorers. They're in Abyssinia. They're Ethiopia. There's little expeditions going off in all sorts of directions. Were they the first people to get to Australia? I mean, first Europeans to get to Australia is something that's sort of quite hotly debated. I think there is some more Portuguese pottery on the coast of Australia or something like that. And the toll on these people is huge. A number of people who don't come back, but I was fascinated by that mentality and their desire to go further. And again, as I said, what do we understand about these people from the way they behaved, and in what way is it different to the people that we are now?
Yeah. Well, let's finish with that. Let's finish with that, Mr. Crowley. What is the book that it's waiting to be written from you? Do you have like a specific theme or specific subject that you want to pay, like, to give it your more attention in the future, and maybe you regret that you haven't read it by now? Or
well, I think I'm going to write. I wrote a book about Venice till 1500, and I think I'm probably going to write a book about Venice to 1500 till the end of the Venetian Republic. I know there are a lot of books out there about it, so I'm kind of slightly hesitant, but I write it in the way that I write it for people who want to read in a certain kind of way. I think beyond that, beyond that, I don't know at the moment. I mean, I think every now and then you get a little thought that you would like to follow up, but I think Venice is, apart from being over visited, really, I only want to go there in February. Is interested. I'm interested in Venetian culture as much as in all their doings in Italy. So I think I'll probably go in that direction, and that will. I don't know how many books I got left in me. I'm slowing down. Each book takes longer than the last one. Somewhere I've got a book which is going to be written for me, which is going to be a book about the travels that I have made in the research. Really, I want to write about. I loved going to Akka in northern Israel, which is a little Islamic port, very ancient, a bit like a Venice without the canals. One of those little labyrinthine places that are tiny but seem huge, with a very, very ancient history that goes way back, into the early Egyptian period and so on. So at some point I'm going to write a kind of a travel book about travels of a misplaced
that will
historian.
be very interesting to read, definitely. I'm going to read it for sure.
You have to hang around for a bit, Georgie. That's going to be my treat book, my self-indulgent book.
I'm not going
Which means
anywhere
I
else.
will read. So,
Roger Crowley, thank you very much for being a guest of G-Spodcast. Yeah.
thank you very much, Georgie. And thank you so much for reading my books.